At my mother's funeral, my family divided her entire estate before the casket even closed and left me with nothing. You never helped the business, my uncle sneered in front of the entire congregation. I let them finish their greedy celebration. Then I stood up and said 4 exact words. My father's wineglass hit the floor, shattering the silence. I had no idea that within hours, federal agents would be involved and our family legacy would be flipped upside down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. My name is Zoya. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful corporate restructuring consultant, I escaped their toxicity in Atlanta, but maintained occasional contact. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and constant stream of church visitors, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A grades, joined honor societies, and tried to earn their love, but I was always the scapegoat. The dirt on my mother Beatrice's grave was barely settling when the vultures descended. We were gathered at her sprawling Atlanta estate for the repast, which is the traditional meal shared after a funeral service. The house was packed with church deacons, choir members, and local politicians all mourning the great Beatrice. The air was thick with the comforting scent of fried chicken, slow-cooked collard greens, simmering with smoked turkey, and rich baked macaroni and cheese. These were the very recipes that had made Beatrice's Southern Elegance a culinary institution and the most famous restaurant in our community. But while the guests paid their respects in the living room, a much darker scene was unfolding in the formal dining room. I stood quietly near the heavy mahogany table dressed in my tailored black morning suit, watching my family drop their masks of grief. My Uncle Desmond, my mother's brother, marched toward me with a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, not from weeping over his sister, but from the expensive liquor he had been sneaking since the burial began. Without warning, he threw a stained, grease-covered kitchen apron directly at my chest. It hit my lapel and fell to the floor. "Put that on and go to the kitchen to wash the serving platters," Desmond snarled, his voice slurring with malicious intent. "Do not just stand there like you own the place. LaToya is taking over as the chief executive officer of the restaurant tomorrow morning, and she has to entertain the head deacons. You abandoned this family and ran off to New York 14 years ago to chase corporate money, so you do not get a seat at this table today. Now pick up the apron and make yourself useful." Before I could even process his blatant disrespect, my older sister LaToya stepped forward. LaToya was the undeniable golden child of the family, always draped in designer labels and dripping with the kind of entitlement that only comes from never having to work a single day in your life. She reached out and aggressively unclasped the vintage diamond and pearl necklace from around my neck. The heavy clasp pinched my skin, but I refused to flinch or show any sign of weakness. "This necklace belongs to the true daughter," LaToya declared, holding the sparkling heirloom up to the light to admire it. "The daughter who actually stayed behind and supported this family through thick and thin. My husband DeAndre and I have big plans for the property anyway. We are going to demolish the original restaurant building and develop a luxury condominium complex right over it. The neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly, and we are going to cash in on the changing demographics. You should just pack your little designer briefcase and head back to your cold Manhattan apartment where you belong." I slowly smoothed the lapels of my blazer, taking a deep, steadying breath. I did not scream or cry. Tears were a currency my family used to manipulate, and I refused to spend mine on them. As LaToya fastened my mother's necklace around her own throat, my mind flashed back to the harsh reality of the past 6 months. When my mother was diagnosed with a terminal illness, her insurance company denied the experimental treatments she desperately needed. The hospital bills skyrocketed to $2 million. While Latoya was busy using our mother's business credit cards to engage in performative grief shopping, buying custom black Chanel dresses and expensive accessories for the funeral, I was the one working 80-hour weeks in New York. I took on grueling corporate restructuring cases, auditing massive global conglomerates, just to quietly funnel every cent I earned into paying those medical bills. I had sacrificed my sleep, my social life, and my own mental health to ensure my mother received the absolute best medical care possible. Latoya had wiped our mother's brow a few times when the church cameras were rolling, but I had literally kept her alive. Yet here I was being treated like a rogue employee who had just been fired from a job she never wanted. The final blow came from the head of the table. My father, Pastor Calvin, stood up slowly. He was a man who commanded a room with his booming baritone voice, a charismatic megachurch leader who hid his deep-seated hypocrisy behind perfectly quoted scripture and tailored church suits. He raised his glass of expensive red wine, looking down his nose at me with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disdain. "Zoya, you turned your back on the church and on the legacy of this proud family," Calvin preached, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room, as if he were delivering a Sunday sermon. "You chose the godless pursuit of northern wealth over the sacred duty of honoring your parents and your community. This estate, the restaurant, the land, all of it belongs to those who have kept the faith and remain devoted to our congregation. The Lord rewards the faithful, not the selfish. You have no moral or legal standing to raise your voice in this house today. Bow your head, accept your rightful place, and leave quietly before you embarrass yourself further in front of our esteemed guests." I looked at the three of them. My Uncle Desmond, the lazy restaurant manager, who had been secretly skimming from the cash registers to pay off his gambling debts for a decade. My sister Latoya, the vain golden child whose entire existence was subsidized by my mother's sweat and tears. And my father Calvin, the supposed man of God, whose massive ego demanded absolute submission from everyone around him. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing them to bask in their false sense of victory. I looked my father dead in the eye, my posture perfectly straight, my voice completely devoid of the emotional hysteria they expected from me. "I own the estate," I said. Those 4 exact words landed like a physical blow to the chest. The color instantly drained from my father's face. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The dark red wine pooled around his expensive leather shoes like blood. Desmond choked on his bourbon, coughing violently as he stared at me in utter disbelief. Latoya's hand froze on the diamond necklace she had just stolen from me, her jaw dropping open in shock. But the shock was short-lived. DeAndre, my flashy, smooth-talking brother-in-law, who always claimed to be a master real estate developer and cryptocurrency investor, stepped out from the shadows near the hallway. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the thick tension in the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slapped it down onto the dining room table with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. "Property deeds do not matter, sweetheart," DeAndre sneered, tapping the paper aggressively with his index finger. "Your mother signed a brand new will exactly 3 days ago. She left total administrative and financial control of the entire estate, the house, the business, and the land to Latoya and me. You get absolutely nothing." I stared at him, feeling adrenaline flood my veins. They genuinely believed a flimsy piece of paper forged in sheer desperation could erase my legal authority. They thought they could bully me into submission, but I was fully prepared. Deshaun waved the crisp white paper in the air like a winning lottery ticket. The smug grin on his face stretched from ear to ear. He stepped closer to me, thrusting the document into my line of sight. He wanted me to read the signature at the bottom. It looked remarkably like my mother's elegant cursive, but the strokes were too heavy. It lacked her natural grace. I recognized the desperate attempt of a man drowning in debt trying to grab a lifeline that did not belong to him. "You see this?" Chloe Deshawn mocked his voice, dripping with condescension. "This is legal proof that your mother finally realized who truly cared about her. She gave Jasmine and me the keys to the kingdom. You can take your little tailored suit and march right back to the airport. Your time here is done." My father did not even wait for my response. Silas pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He bypassed the standard emergency line and dialed a direct number. I knew exactly who he was calling. Chief Marcus Thorne was not just the head of the local police precinct. He was also a prominent member of my father's megachurch congregation. Silas had baptized his children and married his daughter. The corruption ran deep in our community, and my father leveraged his pastoral authority whenever he needed a favor. Marcus Silas said, his voice instantly shifting into its familiar booming pastoral cadence. "We have a family disturbance at the Beatrice estate. My estranged daughter Chloe is refusing to leave the premises. She is trespassing and causing a severe emotional disruption during our time of grief. Yes, I need you to send a squad car immediately. Thank you, Brother Marcus. God bless you." Silas ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at me with pure venom. "The police will be here in less than 5 minutes," Silas announced to the room. The guests who had been peeking through the dining room archway began to murmur among themselves. Uncle Vernon poured himself another glass of bourbon, chuckling under his breath. Jasmine stood beside Deshawn, looking at me with a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. They all believed the battle was already over. Exactly 4 minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights illuminated the large bay windows of the dining room. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the heavy oak front doors. Chief Thorne himself walked in right behind them. His presence was a deliberate show of force meant to intimidate me. The heavy boots of the officers echoed on the hardwood floors as they marched directly into the dining room. Silas immediately stepped forward, playing the role of the aggrieved patriarch. He gestured toward me with a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Officers, please remove her," Silas commanded. "She has no legal right to be in this house. Her mother explicitly left the property to Jasmine and Deshawn. She is refusing to respect her mother's dying wishes." "You did not even visit her in the hospital last week," Silas yelled, his voice rising for the benefit of the eavesdropping guests. "You stayed in New York while your mother was fighting for her life." Jasmine was the one wiping her brow. Jasmine was the one holding her hand. "You are a cold, unnatural daughter, and you do not belong here." Jasmine immediately produced a fresh stream of tears, leaning her head against Deshawn's shoulder. She played the exhausted, devoted daughter perfectly. I stood my ground, keeping my hands loosely clasped in front of me. I let the officers step closer. As they approached, my mind flashed back to the reality of the previous week. Silas was right about one thing. I was not sitting by my mother's bed wiping her brow, but he was entirely wrong about why. While Jasmine was standing in the hospital lobby taking crying selfies for her social media followers to garner sympathy, I was sitting in a sterile conference room on the 5th floor of the hospital. I was meeting secretly with my mother's primary care physicians and a team of estate lawyers. We were frantically working to build an ironclad legal fortress around her assets. We knew Deshawn was millions of dollars in debt from his failed cryptocurrency schemes. We knew Uncle Vernon had been quietly draining the restaurant accounts. I spent every waking hour that week ensuring their greasy hands could never touch the empire my mother built from scratch. Jasmine wiped a fevered brow for Instagram. I secured a legacy for generations. Chief Thorne cleared his throat, looking at me with a mixture of stern authority and pity. "Miss, you need to come with us," Thorne said, extending a hand to guide me toward the door. "If you refuse to leave voluntarily, I will have to place you under arrest for criminal trespassing. Let us not make this difficult on your grieving family." The officer to my left reached for the metal handcuffs resting on his duty belt. The metallic clink of the cuffs shifting caused a collective gasp from the church members watching from the hallway. Vernon chuckled again. Jasmine stopped faking her tears long enough to watch with eager anticipation. I did not move a single inch. I kept my eyes locked on Chief Thorne. Before the officer could unclip the handcuffs, the heavy front door swung open again. The sound of sharp, confident footsteps echoed through the foyer. A tall man in a pristine charcoal gray suit strode into the dining room carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He radiated the kind of ruthless corporate energy that immediately commanded the room. This was Arthur Sterling. He was a senior partner at one of the most feared corporate law firms in Manhattan. He was my personal attorney, and he did not lose. Arthur stepped smoothly between me and the police officers. He did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with federal seals, and handed the top file directly to Chief Thorne. "I suggest you read that very carefully, Chief Thorne." Arthur said, his voice calm, but possessing a razor-sharp edge. "That is a federal injunction issued by the United States District Court. It explicitly bars anyone in this room from removing Chloe from this property. It also freezes every single bank account associated with Beatrice's Southern Elegance and this estate." Chief Thorne stared at the document. His eyes scanned the federal seals and the judge's signature. The color drained from his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the legal power standing in front of him. This was not a local civil dispute anymore. This was a federal matter. I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. Deshawn's smug smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. I stepped toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. "You claim Mom signed that will 3 days ago?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You claim she willingly signed over total control to you and Jasmine?" Deshawn puffed out his chest, trying to regain his lost bravado. "Yes, she did," he stammered. "I have the witnesses right here." Vernon saw it. Silas saw it. "That is absolutely fascinating," I replied, offering him a cold, predatory smile. "Because 3 days ago her doctors placed her in a medically induced coma. Her organs were failing. She was entirely unconscious and sustained by machines. There is zero medical possibility that she held a pen, let alone possessed the cognitive capacity to sign a legal document changing her estate." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the dining room. The guests in the hallway gasped loudly. Deshawn swallowed hard, looking nervously at Silas. "You just submitted a forged document across state lines to a federal bank yesterday afternoon." I continued, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "You tried to use that fake will to access the commercial equity lines of credit. Under federal law, that constitutes wire fraud, bank fraud, and the forgery of a legal instrument. You did not just make a mistake, Deshawn. You committed a severe federal crime." Silas stepped forward, his face flushed with panic and rage. "That is a lie!" Silas shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Your mother told us she wanted Jasmine to have the restaurant. We were simply carrying out her verbal wishes. The paperwork is just a formality." Arthur Sterling stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Actually, Pastor, it is much more than a formality. Furthermore, that forged will is completely useless regardless of when it was signed. Beatrice's assets are not subject to a traditional will." Jasmine grabbed Deshawn's arm, her long acrylic nails digging into his suit jacket. "What does he mean, Deshawn?" she whispered frantically. "What is he talking about?" I decided to deliver the final blow myself. "Mom knew exactly who you people were," I said, looking from Jasmine to Vernon to my father. "She knew you would drain the restaurant dry the moment she passed away. That is why she called me 2 years ago. We moved every single asset, the restaurant, the real estate, the branding rights, and this very house into an irrevocable trust. A will cannot override an irrevocable trust, and I am the sole designated trustee. You own absolutely nothing." The air in the room felt entirely depleted. Chief Thorne took a large step back, physically distancing himself from Silas and Deshawn. As a law enforcement officer, he immediately recognized the extreme danger of the situation. Deshawn had just been publicly implicated in a major federal felony, and Thorne knew he could not risk his own career by assisting them. "Stand down, officers," Thorne commanded, gesturing for his men to step away from me. "This is a federal civil matter. We have no jurisdiction here." Silas watched his greatest ally in the police force retreat. The illusion of his absolute control was shattering in real time. Desperation warped my father's features into something ugly and terrifying. He stepped in front of Deshawn using his broad shoulders to physically shield his son-in-law from the imaginary federal agents he likely envisioned coming through the door. "You want war!" Silas bellowed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and unhinged fury. He pointed his shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you can march down here from New York and steal this family's legacy? You think your fancy lawyers and federal papers can save you from the wrath of God?" "I did not steal anything, Dad," I replied calmly. "I secured it." "Tomorrow is Sunday service." Silas spat spittle flying from his lips. "I will stand before 3,000 congregants. I will take the pulpit, and I will expose you as the devil who stole her own mother's legacy. I will tell the entire city of Atlanta how you forged your way into a trust and robbed your sister blind. By the time I am done preaching tomorrow, you will not be able to walk the streets of Atlanta. The community will drive you out." I looked at the furious, desperate man who called himself a man of God. He was willing to burn his own daughter at the stake to protect his pride and his son-in-law's criminal actions. He believed his congregation would blindly follow his narrative just as they always had. He believed Sunday service would be my execution. He had absolutely no idea that I had already prepared the firewood for his pyre. "I will see you at church tomorrow, Pastor," I said. "I would not miss your sermon for the world." The morning sun beat down harshly on the stained glass windows of the Covenant megachurch. It was an architectural behemoth, a sprawling campus designed to hold 3,000 faithful worshipers at once. I pulled my car into the massive parking lot surrounded by luxury vehicles that betrayed the true financial status of my father's inner circle. I adjusted the rearview mirror, checking my reflection. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit with a stark white silk blouse. It was the armor of a corporate assassin, not the subdued pastel modesty expected of a pastor's grieving daughter. I grabbed my leather briefcase and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. The heavy wooden double doors of the sanctuary stood open, flanked by usher board members in their crisp uniforms. I did not pause or lower my gaze. I walked straight through the entrance and into the cavernous main hall. The moment my heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the foyer, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Word had already spread. My father had spent the entire night calling his most loyal deacons and prayer warriors, spinning his desperate web of lies. As I turned into the center aisle, the low hum of thousands of voices abruptly fell into a deafening, hostile silence. 3,000 pairs of eyes turned to glare at me with unadulterated disgust. I felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on my shoulders, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. I walked slowly, deliberately down the plush red carpet of the center aisle. Whispers hissed through the pews like venomous snakes. They called me greedy. They called me unnatural. They called me the devil in a designer suit. At the front of the sanctuary, my father, Pastor Calvin, stood elevated on the massive oak pulpit. He was already deeply immersed in his performance. Sweat beaded on his forehead, gleaming under the intense theatrical lighting designed specifically for the church television broadcast. His booming baritone voice reverberated through the state-of-the-art sound system, shaking the very floorboards beneath my feet. "We are gathered here today to mourn a saint," Calvin bellowed, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. Beatrice was a mother to this entire community. She fed the hungry, she clothed the poor, and she built a legacy of love. But the devil is always busy, my brothers and sisters. The devil seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. And sometimes the devil wears the face of your own flesh and blood. He pointed a dramatic, sweeping finger in my direction. The roving crane camera swooped down, tracking his movement and projecting my face onto the twin massive screens mounted behind the pulpit. "The prodigal daughter returns," Calvin preached, his voice breaking with manufactured emotion. "She abandoned her family for 14 years, chasing the godless idols of northern wealth. She did not return to wipe her dying mother's brow. She returned only to steal from the righteous. She returned to snatch the food from the mouths of the community, to feed her own insatiable corporate greed." Right on cue, my sister Latoya completely broke down in the front row. She was dressed head to toe in black morning couture, wearing an oversized designer hat with a dramatic veil. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent theatrical sobs. The cameraman immediately pivoted to capture her heartbreak, broadcasting her perfect victim performance to the entire congregation. DeAndre sat beside her, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders, looking up at the pulpit with an expression of pious sorrow. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I kept walking until I reached the space just below the altar steps. I did not flinch under the bright lights. I did not look away from my father's sweating, furious face. I simply stood there waiting for the inevitable physical confrontation. I knew they would never let me challenge their narrative without a fight. Right on schedule, my Uncle Desmond stepped out from the designated deacon's pew. His face was flushed red with anger and the lingering effects of last night's bourbon. He aggressively positioned his bulky frame between me and the altar stairs, blocking my path. He raised his hand, signaling the burly private security guards stationed at the side doors. Two massive men in dark suits immediately began marching down the side aisles toward me, their hands hovering near their communications earpieces. "You have some nerve showing your face here today," Desmond shouted at me, loud enough for the microphone on the pulpit to pick up his voice. "This is holy ground, Zoya, not Wall Street. You cannot come in here and repossess a church. You cannot steal a restaurant that was built by the sweat of this congregation. The profits from Southern Elegance belong to the community. You have no soul." The congregation erupted into a chorus of enthusiastic amens and scattered applause. They were entirely captivated by his righteous indignation. But as I looked at my uncle's furious, flushed face, my mind violently flashed back to a sweltering Tuesday afternoon 16 years ago. I was 16 years old, standing behind the cash register at the original Southern Elegance location. My mother was in the back kitchen, covered in flour and grease, cooking her heart out. Desmond had swaggered in, smelling of cheap cologne and desperate sweat. He had slammed his hand into the cash register, shoving me aside and pulling out $500 in crisp $20 bills. When I begged him to stop telling him we needed that money to pay the meat supplier, he had laughed in my face. He claimed he was taking the money to sponsor a community youth program. Later that night, I found out he had lost every single cent betting on underground poker games in the back room of a local barbershop. He had spent a decade using the word community as a convenient shield to drain my mother's lifeblood and feed his own selfish addictions. His hypocrisy did not enrage me. It simply fueled my absolute, unbreakable calm. I did not raise my hands to fight the security guards who were now standing just 3 feet away, preparing to physically grab my arms and drag me out of the sanctuary. I did not shout or scream or beg for the congregation to listen to my side of the story. Instead, I slowly lifted my chin and looked past my furious father, past the glaring lights, and up toward the VIP viewing balcony, located at the rear of the sanctuary. Sitting quietly in the front row of the balcony, completely hidden from the congregation's view, was Arthur Sterling. My high-powered corporate attorney sat with his legs crossed, casually balancing a sleek silver tablet on his knee. I gave him a single, nearly imperceptible nod. Arthur tapped the screen of his tablet exactly once. The massive high-definition projector screens behind the pulpit, which had previously been displaying rolling lyrics to a traditional hymn, suddenly glitched. The text fractured into distorted, colorful static. A collective gasp rippled through the massive congregation as the screens went completely black. My father froze, gripping his microphone, his pastoral flow entirely derailed by the sudden technical failure. "What is going on up there?" Calvin hissed, his voice echoing loudly over the sound system. "Fix the screens immediately." But the church technical team had already lost control. 3 seconds later, the twin screens flared back to blindingly bright life. They were no longer displaying Bible verses or tearful images of my sister. Instead, both screens displayed a massive, brilliantly clear QR code. Beside the QR code, text appeared in huge, bold, unmistakable red letters. The title of the document read, "DeAndre Holding Corporation and Covenant Megachurch Financials Full Forensic Audit Report." The sanctuary descended into a state of absolute bewildered silence. No one moved. The security guards hesitated, looking up at the screens in profound confusion. My father turned around, staring at the massive audit title, his mouth falling open in sheer terror. Latoya stopped her fake sobbing instantly, sitting bolt upright in her pew. DeAndre's protective arm fell away from his wife, his face draining of all color, as he recognized the name of his own offshore shell company, displayed for 3,000 people to see. I did not need a microphone to make myself heard. In the dead silence of the sanctuary, my voice cut through the air, sharp, clear, and utterly unbothered. "You are absolutely right, Uncle Desmond." I projected my voice, letting it bounce off the walls of the Great Hall. "The money definitely belongs to the community. I completely agree with you. So perhaps the esteemed pastor can take a brief moment to explain to his faithful flock exactly why $1.5 million from the Church Orphanage Building Fund was wired directly into DeAndre's private offshore cryptocurrency wallets." For 2 full seconds, nobody breathed. Then absolute pandemonium erupted. It was like dropping a lit match into a powder keg. 3,000 congregants collectively exploded into chaos. Voices rose in a cacophony of shock, outrage, and furious disbelief. The sanctuary morphed into a sea of frantic movement. People did not attack me. Instead, 3,000 smartphones were simultaneously raised into the air, pointing directly at the massive screens. The bright flashes of cameras and the soft chime of scanning applications filled the room as the entire congregation instantly downloaded the unredacted financial records. My father stood frozen behind the pulpit, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic destruction of his entire kingdom. He tried to speak to command the room to listen to him, but his voice failed him entirely. His trembling hand lost its grip. The heavy wireless microphone slipped from his slick fingers, dropping onto the hard wooden surface of the podium. The impact sent a deafening, piercing screech echoing through the speakers, forcing everyone in the room to cover their ears. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase as the sound of the microphone feedback slowly faded into the roaring anger of the betrayed crowd. I looked at DeAndre, who was currently sinking lower into his expensive pew, frantically typing on his phone in a desperate attempt to salvage his frozen offshore accounts. Latoya was staring at her husband, her wide eyes reflecting the sudden, horrifying realization that her entire luxury lifestyle was built on stolen orphanage funds. Desmond, the man who had just invoked the sacred name of the community to banish me from the church, now looked around like a trapped rat. The congregants sitting nearest to the altar, who had already managed to scan the code and open the audit report, were beginning to stand up. They were pointing their phones directly at the pulpit, shouting angry questions, demanding accountability for their stolen tithes and offerings. The very people Desmond had tried to rally against me were now turning their furious, righteous gaze toward the real thieves standing on the altar. The 2 security guards who had been moments away from dragging me out of the building slowly backed away. They were employees of the church, but they were also members of the community. They looked from me to the massive screens and then to my father. They lowered their hands, stepping back into the shadows and completely abandoning their posts. They would not protect a man who had stolen from orphans. I remained completely motionless, watching my father physically crumble under the weight of his own profound hypocrisy. The sweat that had previously been a prop for his passionate sermon now poured down his face in cold, terrified rivers. His eyes darted wildly around the sanctuary, searching for a friendly face, an ally, a way out. He found nothing but 3,000 angry, betrayed faces, holding up undeniable digital proof of his crimes. The empire of lies was officially dead, and I was the one holding the match. The sanctuary erupted into a deafening roar of betrayal. It was the sound of 3,000 faithful people simultaneously realizing their spiritual shepherd had been slaughtering them for their wool. The collective pinging and buzzing of smartphones echoed through the massive vaulted ceiling like a swarm of angry locusts. Every single person in the pews was scanning the massive QR code projected behind the pulpit, downloading the devastating 50-page forensic audit my team had meticulously compiled. I watched as generations of churchgoers, elderly women who had donated their meager Social Security checks, working-class families who had tithed their grocery money, scrolled through the indisputable evidence of their pastor's ungodly greed. They were staring at high-resolution digital copies of offshore wire transfers, shell company registration documents, and bank statements clearly linking the Covenant Megachurch Orphanage Building Fund directly to DeAndre's private cryptocurrency wallets in the Cayman Islands. Up on the altar, my father Calvin was actively disintegrating. The pristine image he had cultivated for decades was burning to ash right in front of his eyes. He lunged for the backup microphone on the podium, his hands trembling so violently he nearly knocked the heavy wooden stand over. "Do not look at those screens!" Calvin bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He wiped the heavy sweat from his brow, staining his white cuff. "This is the devil's deception. This is a demonic attack on the righteous. These are fabricated lies from a godless daughter who wants to destroy the holy work we have built in this community. Avert your eyes from the temptation of slander." But the congregation was no longer listening to his silver-tongued sermons. The spell was broken. From the front row, head Deacon Wallace, a towering man who had served the church for 40 years, stood up. His face was a mask of righteous fury. He held his smartphone up, displaying a highlighted bank transfer receipt. He marched directly up the altar steps, flanked by 4 other senior members of the deacon board. They completely ignored Calvin's frantic shouting and surrounded the pulpit. "You transferred $1.5 million of the orphanage fund into a corporate holding account," Wallace stated, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. "We trusted you, Calvin. You told us those funds were delayed by municipal zoning permits. You stole from children to fund real estate scams." Before my father could formulate another pathetic lie, a sudden blur of motion caught my peripheral vision. Latoya had charged out of the front pew. She crossed the red-carpeted distance between us, with terrifying speed, her designer heels digging into the floor. Her face was twisted into a hideous mask of entitled rage. Without a single word of warning, she swung her arm back and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across my left cheek. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed sharply over the chaotic rumbling of the sanctuary. The sheer force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and a sharp metallic taste of copper instantly flooded my mouth as my teeth cut into the inside of my cheek. "You ruined our father!" Latoya screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical as she raised her hand to strike me again. "You destroyed our family name. You are a jealous, bitter monster." I did not raise my arms to block her. I did not step back. I simply slowly turned my head back to face her, locking my eyes onto hers with an icy, unblinking stare. The physical sting of the slap was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological blows this family had dealt me my entire life. As I stared at her trembling, tear-streaked face, my mind violently snapped back to a humid afternoon when I was 16 years old. I had spent 6 grueling months building an autonomous robotics project for the state science fair. It was my guaranteed ticket to a full college scholarship and my only escape route from Atlanta. I had stayed up until 4 in the morning for weeks, meticulously wiring every single circuit. Latoya, who was 18, and furious that I had refused to write her senior history term paper, had walked into my room while I was getting a glass of water. By the time I returned, she had taken a heavy brass bookend and smashed my robot into unrecognizable pieces of plastic and frayed wire. When I screamed in devastation, Latoya immediately began sobbing hysterically, clutching her hand and running downstairs to our father. She told Calvin that I had thrown a psychotic tantrum over a coding error and had violently smashed my own project, nearly hitting her in the process. Calvin had not even bothered to ask for my side of the story. He had grounded me for a month, calling me an unstable, ungrateful child who needed heavy prayer to cure my angry spirit. He had comforted Latoya, praising her for trying to help her troubled younger sister. Latoya had smirked at me over his shoulder, her tears drying instantly. She had always weaponized her status as the delicate victim to mask her profound cruelty. But we were not teenagers in our childhood home anymore. We were standing in front of 3,000 people who were finally seeing the truth. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a pristine white tissue. I calmly extended my hand, offering the tissue to my sister. Her heavy theatrical mascara was running down her cheeks, leaving ugly black streaks across her expensive foundation. "I did not ruin him, Latoya," I said, my voice perfectly measured and devoid of any emotional reaction to her violence. "I just brought the receipts. He ruined himself the moment he decided greed was his true religion." Latoya stared at the tissue in my hand, completely paralyzed by my refusal to engage in her chaotic drama. She slowly lowered her raised hand, realizing that her usual tactics of physical intimidation and emotional manipulation were entirely useless against me. I was not the scared 16-year-old girl crying over broken circuits anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. Behind us, the confrontation on the altar had reached its inevitable climax. Deacon Wallace forcefully snatched the backup microphone from Calvin's trembling hands. The sharp feedback squeal silenced the remaining murmurs in the sanctuary. Wallace turned his back on my father and faced the congregation. "By the authority vested in the deacon board of the Covenant megachurch, and effective immediately, Calvin is hereby stripped of his pastoral title." Wallace announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are no longer the shepherd of this flock. You are no longer welcome in this sanctuary. We will be handing these financial documents directly to the federal authorities and the Internal Revenue Service tomorrow morning. May God have mercy on your soul, because the law certainly will not." Two of the burly church security guards, who had previously been ordered to remove me, now stepped up onto the altar. They flanked my father, grabbing him firmly by both arms. Calvin was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate terror. He tried to pull away from the guards, shouting incoherent prayers and curses, but they easily overpowered him. They stripped the ceremonial pastoral stole from around his neck, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of purple silk. The congregation watched in stony silence as the great Pastor Calvin was humiliated, disrobed, and physically dragged off his own pulpit, headed toward the administrative offices to await the police. I watched him disappear through the heavy oak doors, feeling a profound sense of closure. The tyrannical patriarch, who had ruled our family through fear and religious guilt, was finally dethroned. I turned away, ready to leave the sanctuary and head back to the restaurant to officially begin restructuring my mother's true legacy. But before I could take a single step toward the center aisle, a sudden booming sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a loud, obnoxious, hysterical laughter. I turned to look in the side pews. My Uncle Desmond was standing up, leaning heavily against the wooden bench. He was completely unbothered by the fact that his brother-in-law had just been publicly disgraced and detained. Desmond clapped his large hands together, the sound echoing strangely in the quiet sanctuary. Beside him, DeAndre had stopped frantically typing on his phone. DeAndre slipped his device into his pocket, replacing his panicked expression with a cold, calculating smirk. "You really think you won, do you not, accountant?" Desmond shouted over the heads of the stunned congregants. "You think projecting some bank statements on a screen makes you the boss of this family? You think because you hold a piece of paper that says, 'Trustee,' you actually control Beatrice's southern elegance?" I narrowed my eyes, watching my uncle closely. His laughter was not the sound of a defeated man. It was the arrogant gloating of a seasoned hustler who had already played his next hand. "We knew you were snooping around New York," Desmond sneered, taking a step out into the aisle. "We knew you were talking to those fancy lawyers behind our backs, trying to lock up the assets, so we did not just sit around waiting for you to strike. While you were busy preparing your little church presentation last night, DeAndre and I were busy doing some restructuring of our own." DeAndre stepped up beside Desmond, straightening his lapels. He looked directly at me, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "You might own the building, Zoya," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And you might control the corporate entity. But a restaurant is not a building. A restaurant is the food and the people who cook it." Desmond let out another booming laugh, pointing a thick finger at me. "Last night we emptied every single operating account associated with Southern Elegance," Desmond declared proudly. "We took every dollar of petty cash, every vendor payment reserve, and every payroll account. But that is not even the best part. We went into your mother's private safe and we took the master recipe books. We hold the original handwritten formulas for the spice blends, the marinades, and the batters that made this family rich. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. The master recipe books were the holy grail of Beatrice's southern elegance. They were the closely guarded intellectual property that could never be replicated by memory alone. And we did not stop there, DeAndre added, stepping closer. We called a mandatory staff meeting at midnight. We told the entire kitchen crew, the waitstaff, and the management team that you were planning to fire them all and sell the property to corporate developers. We offered them a 20% pay raise to walk out that door with us. We poached the entire staff, Zoya, every single one of them. Desmond spread his arms wide, addressing both me and the bewildered congregation. We signed a commercial lease on the vacant property right across the street from your mother's old spot. Desmond shouted, his voice filled with arrogant victory. We are opening a brand new restaurant tomorrow morning. It is called Beatrice's True Legacy. We have the money, we have the staff, and we have the exact recipes that this community loves. DeAndre laughed, mirroring his father-in-law's smug arrogance. You can keep the irrevocable trust. Zoya, DeAndre sneered, turning his back on me. Because as of this morning, your precious building is nothing but an empty bankrupt shell. Good luck serving tailored suits for dinner. The two men turned and walked up the side aisle, their heads held high, leaving me standing in the center of the sanctuary. The victory I had just secured over my father suddenly tasted like ash. They had gutted my mother's legacy from the inside out, leaving me with a worthless, empty brick building. The war was far from over. The morning sun baked the Atlanta asphalt, casting a harsh glare through the large plate glass windows of Beatrice's southern elegance. I stood perfectly still in the center of the main dining room. The silence was absolute and suffocating. There was no familiar clatter of heavy iron skillets from the kitchen. There was no rich, comforting aroma of buttermilk biscuits baking in the industrial ovens. The tables were bare, stripped of their checkered cloths, and the vintage brass cash register sat open and completely hollowed out. Vernon and Jasmine had been ruthlessly efficient, leaving nothing but empty physical space behind. They had picked my mother's legacy clean overnight, leaving only grease stains and echoing memories. Directly across the wide boulevard, a completely different scene was unfolding. The bass from massive outdoor speakers rattled the windows of my empty dining room. Vernon and Jasmine had spared absolutely no expense for their grand opening spectacle. A giant inflatable balloon man danced wildly in the morning breeze, flanking a massive vinyl banner that read, "Beatrice's True Legacy," in bright neon garish colors. They had illegally recreated my mother's iconic beloved logo, replacing her dignified silhouette with a cartoonish and incredibly cheap-looking caricature. A long line of eager customers already wrapped around the block. Many of them were my mother's most loyal regulars, the people who had eaten her Sunday specials for 20 years. They were cheering and clapping, completely oblivious to the massive theft they were currently celebrating. Jasmine stood at the center of the chaos, holding an oversized pair of novelty golden scissors. She wore a bright red designer sundress that cost more than a month of line cook wages. She was waving enthusiastically to the cheering crowd, blowing kisses, and playing the role of the very devoted culinary heiress perfectly. Vernon stood right beside her, wearing a crisp white chef's coat that he had absolutely not earned. He was shaking hands and handing out free samples of sweet potato hush puppies baked using stolen ingredients from my depleted pantry. They looked invincible. They looked like they had successfully stolen the crown and paraded it right in front of my face. The heavy glass door of my empty restaurant swung open, jolting me from my thoughts. The sharp chime of the entry bell echoed painfully loud in the silent room. Shirley, the head chef, marched directly inside the massive brick restaurant building. Shirley was a formidable woman who had worked side by side with my mother for 18 years. Her hands bore the burn scars of decades of relentless kitchen work. I had known her since I was a child, doing my homework at the back prep tables while she slipped me pieces of fried catfish. I offered her a tentative smile, hoping she had come to explain the sudden mass exodus. My smile vanished instantly. Shirley marched directly up to me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She stopped 2 feet away, hawked deeply from deep inside. She spat a thick wad of saliva directly onto the floor, inches from my expensive leather shoes. "Your sister told us everything last night." Shirley growled, her voice trembling with intense fury. "Your sister told us exactly what your fancy New York corporate plan was. You were going to fire the whole kitchen staff. You were going to cut our wages, slash our health benefits, and gentrify the entire menu for white folks. You ain't got no soul, Chloe. You are nothing but a cold-blooded suit. Beatrice would roll over in her grave if she just saw you today. If she saw what you tried to do to her people." Shirley finished, turning away in disgust. I did not flinch. I did not wipe my shoes. I simply stared into the furious, betrayed eyes of a woman I had once considered family. The sheer brilliance of Jasmine and Vernon's psychological manipulation clicked into place with sickening clarity. They had not just stolen money and recipes, they had weaponized the deeply ingrained working-class fears of my mother's most loyal employees. They had painted me as the ruthless corporate raider coming down from Manhattan to destroy their fragile, humble livelihoods. They had used my tailored suits and my law degree against me, twisting my success into a weapon of oppression. They had convinced these hardworking people that abandoning my mother's actual restaurant was an act of righteous rebellion. Shirley glared at me one last time before turning on her heel and marching back out the door, heading straight across the street to join Vernon's stolen kitchen crew. I did not call after her. I did not beg her to stay or try to frantically explain the truth about the irrevocable trust or the missing church orphanage funds they completely stole. Pleading was a language I refused to speak. I took a deep breath, smoothing out the imaginary wrinkles in my charcoal blazer. I picked up my briefcase from the empty counter and walked out the front doors, locking my mother's hollowed-out dream behind me. The heat of the morning pavement radiated through the thin soles of my shoes as I stepped off the curb. I walked directly across the wide, busy street, never breaking my steady, measured stride. I did not dodge the incoming traffic. The massive cars slowed down and honked their horns as I confidently walked past. I stepped onto the opposite sidewalk, stepping right into the heart of Vernon's loud, chaotic block party. The lively music thumped heavily against my chest. The dense crowd of celebrating customers parted around me like the Red Sea. My sharp corporate attire and razor-sharp focus stood out violently against the casual, festive atmosphere. The stolen waitstaff, wearing brand-new aprons with the fake logo, shrank back nervously as I walked past them. I ignored their guilty whispers. I kept my eyes locked on the large, shiny hostess stand positioned right outside the brand-new clear glass entrance double doors. Jasmine was leaning against the stand, laughing loudly at a joke Vernon had just made. Her golden scissors were resting on the podium, waiting for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. When she finally noticed me cutting through the crowd, her laughter died instantly. A brief flash of genuine panic crossed her face before she forcefully morphed it back into a mask of arrogant superiority. She puffed out her chest, crossing her arms and blocking my path to the entrance. Vernon stepped up right beside her, crossing his bulky arms and glaring at me, trying to look physically overly intimidating today. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their aggressive posture. I stopped perfectly still, directly in front of the shiny wooden hostess stand. "I would like to order 1 large sweet tea," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying a deadly polite customer service tone. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a crisp new $100 bill, and placed it flat on the surface of the stand. "Keep the change. It looks like you are going to need every single penny you can possibly scrounge up to effectively pay for your coming legal defense." Jasmine sneered, looking down at the $100 bill like it was a profound insult. "What is this, Chloe?" she mocked, gesturing broadly to the huge crowd watching us so closely. "Are you here to finally admit defeat? You want a front row seat to watch us build the real empire? You have absolutely nothing left." I ignored her taunts entirely. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with a bright red wax stamp. The seal bore the unmistakable, intimidating insignia of Arthur Sterling's Manhattan corporate law firm. I slid the thick package slowly across the smooth wood of the hostess stand until it rested directly over the $100 bill. Jasmine stared at the envelope, her arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. She grabbed the package aggressively, tearing the heavy paper open with her long acrylic nails. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents, scanning the bold heading on the very first page. She threw her head back and let out a sharp, obnoxious laugh, holding the papers up for Vernon to rapidly see. "A cease and desist order." Jasmine shrieked extremely loudly at me. "You are pathetic, Chloe. You really think this scares us? You cannot copyright fried chicken and collard greens, you corporate drone. Anybody can cook this food." I smiled warmly, offering her a look of profound pity. "You are right, Jasmine," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous razor-sharp whisper. "You absolutely cannot copyright a recipe, but you can commit corporate espionage. And when you steal proprietary trade secrets from an irrevocable trust and transport them across state lines to secure a new commercial bank loan, that is a federal felony, punishable by 20 years in a federal prison." I stood alone inside the empty shell of my mother's restaurant. The familiar clatter of iron skillets was completely gone. Through the large plate glass windows, I watched the chaotic street party unfolding directly across the wide boulevard. Vernon and Jasmine were hosting a massive, flashy grand opening for their stolen enterprise, Beatrice's True Legacy. They had blocked off the sidewalk, blasting loud, festive music and poaching every single one of Beatrice's loyal customers. The heavy glass door to my empty dining room swung open. Shirley, the old head chef, who had watched me grow up, marched inside. I smiled, hoping she had come to explain the sudden mass exodus. Shirley stopped 2 feet away, hawked deeply, and spat directly at my feet. "Your sister told us everything last night?" Shirley growled, her voice trembling with intense fury. "Your sister told us you were going to cut our wages and gentrify the menu for white folks. You ain't got no soul, Chloe. You are nothing but a cold-blooded corporate suit." I stared into the betrayed eyes of a woman I had once considered family. The sheer brilliance of Jasmine and Vernon's psychological manipulation clicked into place with sickening clarity. They had weaponized the deeply ingrained working-class fears of my mother's loyal employees, playing on their terror of corporate greed. Shirley turned on her heel and marched back out, heading straight across the street to join Vernon's stolen kitchen crew. I did not beg the chef to stay. Instead, I walked directly across the street, cutting through the loud, celebratory crowd. I walked up to Jasmine, who was standing at a shiny hostess stand, preparing to cut a giant red ribbon with oversized golden scissors. "I would like to order 1 sweet tea," I said, my voice perfectly calm. I reached into my briefcase, paid with a crisp $100 bill, and slid a thick sealed legal envelope onto the hostess stand. Jasmine snatched the heavy legal envelope from the wood and burst into a harsh, shrill laugh that pierced through the festive music. She aggressively tore the thick parchment open with her long acrylic nails, pulling out the stack of documents. "A cease and desist," Jasmine shrieked, waving the papers in the air for the crowd to see. "You are pathetic. You really think this scares us? You can't copyright fried chicken and collard greens, you corporate drone." Jasmine threw the paperwork directly onto the ground, grinding the pages into the dirt with her designer heel. Vernon chuckled, wiping his greasy hands on his pristine white chef coat. He stepped up beside Jasmine, wrapping a heavy arm around her shoulders. "You can wave all the fancy Manhattan papers you want, Chloe," Vernon sneered. "A piece of paper does not fry chicken." A bright spotlight suddenly blinded me, cutting through the morning glare. A local news van had pulled up to the curb, a reporter pushing aggressively through the dense crowd. Jasmine immediately straightened her posture, adjusting her bright red sundress and flashing a brilliant practice smile toward the camera lens. Vernon puffed out his chest, playing the role of the humble, hardworking chef. They turned their backs on me and began to brag directly to the local news cameras. "We are so thrilled to welcome the community to Beatrice's True Legacy," Jasmine announced loudly. "We brought the entire original kitchen staff right across the street. We are the true heirs of the Southern flavor, and we will not let corporate greed steal our culture." I stood silently watching their televised performance. I slowly turned my head to look at the massive glowing menu board mounted above the main entrance of their rival restaurant. It listed every single one of my mother's iconic dishes. Seeing those beloved dishes displayed under their cheap stolen logo triggered a visceral memory pulling me backward through time. 3 years ago, the smell of sterile antiseptic had replaced the comforting aroma of my mother's cooking. I was sitting in a cramped, dimly lit room on the cardiovascular floor of the hospital. The relentless rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. I was holding my weeping mother as she lay in the narrow hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. She wept softly, her tears soaking the thin hospital pillowcase as Beatrice finally confessed the dark truth she had been hiding. "Vernon is destroying the business, Chloe," she had whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion and profound heartbreak. "He is bleeding the operating accounts dry. They think I do not know, but I see the numbers. They are waiting for me to die so they can pick the bones clean." My mother had squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I built Southern elegance for our family," she said, looking at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "Beatrice had begged me to stop them. I need you to use those sharp New York brains of yours, Chloe. Protect the family legacy from the family itself." The memory faded, replaced by the loud cheering of the crowd and the bright glare of the local news camera. I looked at Vernon in his unearned chef coat and Jasmine basking in her stolen spotlight. I smiled warmly, offering Jasmine a look of profound pity. "You're right," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "You can't copyright a recipe, but you can commit corporate espionage." I stepped forward, placing myself directly in the center of the camera frame, completely blocking Jasmine from the lens. The reporter looked surprised, but immediately angled her microphone toward me, sensing a dramatic shift in the narrative. I looked directly into the camera, ensuring every word I spoke would be broadcast perfectly clear to the entire city. 3 years ago, my mother and I restructured Southern Elegance. I announced, my voice steady and echoing with absolute authority. We knew there were bad actors circling the business. We knew people would try to steal what she had built. We didn't just trademark the name of the restaurant. We took the handwritten formulas from those master recipe books and we chemically engineered them. We patented the proprietary spice blends with the FDA. Furthermore, I continued, my voice rising to carry over the silent crowd. We registered the VIP corporate catering database, which you stole last night, as protected trade secrets under a corporate holding company that I 100% own. Jasmine's smile vanished instantly. She looked at Vernon, who was suddenly staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The crowd around us fell silent, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the legal terms I was dropping. The reporter pushed the microphone closer, practically buzzing with excitement over this explosive, exclusive scoop. I turned away from the camera and looked dead at Vernon. His bulky chest was heaving, and the smug confidence had completely drained from his face, leaving behind nothing but cold, sickening dread. "Opening this restaurant and serving those specific recipes using my stolen catering lists isn't just a family feud," I said, my words slicing through the humid air like a scalpel. "Under federal law, it is corporate espionage and grand larceny of intellectual property. When the federal marshals arrive, they will not just shut down this illegal operation. They will seize every single asset you purchased with the stolen funds. You will be facing decades behind bars." The heavy glass double doors of Beatrice's True Legacy violently swung open, shattering the tense silence. Deshaun stormed out of the back office, his face flushed dark red with absolute unhinged fury. He was flanked by 4 massive private security guards dressed in black tactical gear. Deshaun forcefully pushed his way through the frozen crowd, marching directly up to the shiny hostess stand. He had clearly been watching the local news broadcast from the high-definition monitors inside the restaurant, and realized his entire illicit investment was collapsing in real time. He glared at the camera before turning his wrath fully onto me. His hands were balled into tight fists, trembling with uncontrollable rage at the sudden total destruction of his carefully laid criminal plans. He had foolishly believed that his stolen wealth and extremely aggressive tactics would easily crush my mother's small business. His offshore accounts were already permanently frozen by the federal injunction, and now his physical restaurant was a massive active crime scene operating on stolen intellectual property. He had severely underestimated the meticulous ironclad legal trap I had spent 3 grueling years constructing specifically for this very moment. The silence stretching between us was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the morning city traffic and the clicking of the news camera. "Talk is cheap, Chloe," Deshawn shouted, spitting the venomous words directly at my face. "You think you can march down here and intimidate us with your empty legal jargon? I have millions in backing. I'll bury you in litigation for decades." Deshawn took an aggressive step forward, invading my personal space, until the toes of his custom Italian leather Oxfords touched my shoes. He loomed over me, using his towering height to force me to break eye contact. His chest puffed out against his tailored suit jacket. He wanted me to cower. He wanted me to shrink away from his toxic bravado, just like my mother had always done whenever the men in this family raised their voices. He wanted to see fear in my eyes, but I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, blank stare. "Listen to me carefully, you little corporate parasite," Deshawn sneered, his hot breath washing over my face. "You are out of your league. You think your fancy New York law degree means anything down here in Atlanta. I have deep-pocketed investors backing this entire operation. I have local politicians eating out of the palm of my hand. We own this city now. We have unlimited capital, and we will crush you in court until you are begging us for a job washing dishes. You are nothing but a gnat, and I will swat you into oblivion." Jasmine stepped up to join her husband, feeding off his aggressive energy. She raised her left hand dramatically, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, specifically to show off the blinding sparkle of her brand-new diamond-encrusted watch. The massive bezel caught the morning sunlight, throwing fractured rainbows across the faces of the stunned crowd. She wanted everyone to see her wealth. "You really should have just stayed in your tiny apartment, Chloe." Jasmine laughed, a high-pitched grating sound. "Look at you. You are wearing the same boring gray suit you wore to Thanksgiving 3 years ago. We are untouchable here. We have real wealth now. We are building generational power while you are still just a bitter, lonely woman pushing papers for a basic salary. You cannot touch us. We are so far above your pay grade that you cannot even comprehend the type of money we are playing with today." I kept my posture rigid, refusing to yield a single inch. My eyes drifted slowly from Jasmine's ostentatious diamond watch down to Deshawn's expensive bespoke suit. As I took in their flashy display of stolen wealth, a vivid memory from a past Thanksgiving dinner materialized in my mind, cutting through the noise. I was sitting quietly at my mother's dining room table, eating my sweet potatoes, while Deshawn ruthlessly mocked my modest lifestyle. He had spent the evening making cruel jokes about my 5-year-old sedan and my unbranded clothing. He pointed his silver fork at me and called me a broke wage slave in front of our extended family. He told everyone loudly that my college degrees were completely useless because I did not have a luxury watch or a fast sports car to show for my relentless academic efforts. Jasmine had giggled along, agreeing enthusiastically. They were completely oblivious to the stark reality of my financial situation. They had absolutely no idea that I was earning a high 7-figure salary at one of the most ruthless financial law firms in the country. They did not know that I actively chose to live in a remarkably modest apartment because I was secretly funneling 90% of my income directly into Beatrice's failing business accounts. I had lived incredibly frugally, denying myself every luxury, so I could quietly pay off the massive crushing debts that Vernon and Deshawn had secretly racked up. I sacrificed my personal comfort to keep the kitchen lights on, and the loyal staff paid while they played pretend millionaires. Their absolute ignorance was their greatest weakness. They continuously confused flashy accessories with actual structural power. They foolishly believed that recklessly spending stolen money was the exact same thing as genuinely earning it. They thought their loud designer clothes made them invincible giants. I slowly brought my left hand up, deliberately pulling back the crisp cuff of my gray blazer. I did not have a diamond-encrusted watch or tennis bracelets. I simply wore a functional, sleek black smartwatch with a plain rubber band. I deliberately tapped the dark glass screen twice, bringing the digital interface to life. I looked up, meeting Deshawn's furious, arrogant gaze with a terrifyingly calm smile that contained absolutely no warmth. You really should not brag about your deep-pocketed investors on live television. Deshawn, I said, my voice projecting clearly enough for the local news microphone to capture every single perfectly articulated syllable. The news reporter, standing just a few feet away, eagerly thrust the foam-covered microphone closer, her camera operator rapidly adjusting the heavy lens to zoom directly in on Deshawn's suddenly pale face. "What are you talking about?" Deshawn demanded, his voice faltering slightly, as a tiny flicker of genuine uncertainty cracked his deeply aggressive facade. His thick eyebrows knitted together in sudden confusion. "I am talking about your unlimited capital." I continued, my tone remaining highly conversational, but laced with lethal legal precision. "You see, it is incredibly dangerous to publicly boast about your financial backing when those specific investors are actually the church orphanage funds that you illegally wired into your private offshore accounts." Jasmine gasped loudly, taking a sudden frantic step back from me. She looked around at the crowd, her eyes wide with mounting terror as the celebrating customers began to murmur among themselves, sensing the sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The joyous street party was rapidly turning into an active crime scene. "Shut your mouth!" Deshawn hissed, leaning in close and glancing nervously at the glowing red recording light of the news camera. "You are lying. You do not have any proof of that. You are just trying to slander my good name because you are jealous of our massive success. I did not just expose your massive theft to the deacon board this morning, Deshawn," I explained slowly, tilting my head slightly to the side to observe his rising panic. "You honestly thought I would stop at a simple church audit. You thought I would just embarrass your corrupt father-in-law and let you simply walk away with millions of dollars in stolen charity funds to seamlessly fund a stolen restaurant. You underestimate me just as much as you consistently underestimated my brilliant, hardworking mother." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to back away. He stumbled slightly, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the red carpet. I handed my entire unredacted forensic accounting file directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division, Y stated clearly, letting the acronyms hang heavily in the humid morning air. I gave them the routing numbers, the offshore shell company registries, and the exact digital signatures you recklessly used to forge the final transfer documents. I gave them a beautifully mapped-out blueprint of your entire criminal enterprise bound in a neat little binder. The blood completely drained from Deshawn's face, leaving his dark skin a sickly grayish hue. The towering, aggressive man who had arrogantly tried to physically intimidate me just moments ago suddenly looked like a terrified, lost child. His expensive custom suit seemed to hang loosely on his collapsing, slumping frame. Vernon, who had been standing slightly behind Jasmine, let out a low, panicked groan and began backing slowly toward the glass doors of their restaurant, desperately looking for an escape route that did not exist. "You called the feds!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. She violently grabbed Deshawn's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging violently into the fabric of his tailored sleeve. "Tell me she is lying, Deshawn. Tell me she does not have those files. Tell me we are safe." But Deshawn could not speak to reassure his frantic wife. He was staring past my shoulder, looking out toward the busy morning intersection. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with the absolute certainty of his impending legal doom. He was watching his entire fabricated reality shatter entirely. A sudden piercing screech of heavy tires violently tearing against the asphalt shattered the calm morning air. The loud festive music blasting from the outdoor speakers was instantly drowned out by the aggressive wail of multiple approaching sirens. The dense crowd of customers screamed and scattered wildly, pushing each other out of the way as four massive black SUVs aggressively hopped the curb and swerved directly onto the sidewalk. The armored SUVs formed a tactical blockade, sealing off the street and securely trapping Deshawn and Jasmine. Armed federal agents stepped out of the vehicles, moving with terrifying coordinated efficiency. I stepped forward confidently, closing the remaining physical space between us. Using stolen church funds to finance a commercial business is a serious federal offense, Deshawn I whispered. But by actively opening your doors here today, you officially crossed the line into money laundering. The heavy silence that followed my words was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of sirens and the aggressive screech of heavily armored tires. Federal agents poured out of the black tactical vehicles, moving with absolute terrifying precision. They wore dark bulletproof vests, emblazoned with bold yellow FBI and IRS letters. The festive atmosphere of the grand opening completely disintegrated into absolute chaos. The massive crowd of eager customers who had been cheering just moments ago now shrieked in genuine terror, scattering wildly in every single direction. They knocked over the shiny velvet rope stanchions and trampled the decorative floral arrangements in their frantic rush to escape the federal raid. Deshawn did not even have time to formulate a cohesive sentence. Two massive federal agents grabbed his arms violently, twisting them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply over the screaming crowd. Deshawn struggled wildly, his face contorted into a mask of pure feral panic. He shouted incoherent threats, demanding his expensive lawyers, citing his absolute imaginary invincibility. But the agents completely ignored him. They shoved him roughly against the side of the shiny wooden hostess stand, patting down his tailored suit pockets and stripping him of his concealed weapons and burner phones. Across the sidewalk, Uncle Vernon was faring no better. The crisp white chef coat he had worn with such unearned, arrogant pride was now stained with dirt and grease as three agents wrestled him to the concrete pavement. Vernon wheezed heavily, his large chest heaving as they securely cuffed his hands behind his broad back. He looked like a deflated balloon stripped of all his unearned culinary glory and reduced to nothing but a common petty thief. Jasmine watched her entire stolen empire collapse in real time. Her eyes bulged wildly, her jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that drowned out the wailing sirens. She dropped forcefully to her knees, her expensive designer sundress tearing against the rough concrete sidewalk. She clawed at the air, frantically reaching out for her husband, as the agents forcefully dragged Deshawn toward the back of an armored SUV. Jasmine completely abandoned her arrogant persona, devolving into a sobbing, chaotic mess. The diamond-encrusted watch she had just flaunted so proudly scraped harshly against the pavement, completely forgotten in the face of absolute ruin. Before I could even process the profound satisfaction of watching them fall, a sudden, violent commotion erupted at the edge of the police barricade. A tall, imposing figure aggressively shoved his way past the retreating customers and the flashing red and blue police lights. It was my father, Silas. He looked absolutely nothing like the perfectly manicured spiritual leader who had commanded the Covenant megachurch pulpit just hours ago. He was completely stripped of his purple silk pastoral collar. His expensive tailored suit jacket was missing, and his white dress shirt was heavily wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around wildly with the manic, desperate energy of a cornered predator. He locked his furious gaze directly onto me, marching across the chaotic street with terrifying speed. "You did this!" Silas roared, his booming voice echoing harshly over the sirens. "You destroyed your own flesh and blood. You are a wicked, soulless abomination, Chloe." I stood perfectly still, watching the tyrannical patriarch approach. For my entire life, Silas had used intense fear and heavy religious guilt to control every single aspect of our household. He had twisted Holy Scripture to justify his absolute emotional abuse, demanding total blind submission from my mother, my sister, and me. He had always projected an aura of divine, untouchable authority. But looking at him now, I did not see a powerful shepherd. I saw the true monster lurking behind the sacred pulpit. I saw a pathetic, greedy man who had used the offering plate as his personal piggy bank and was now completely terrified of facing earthly justice. "You destroyed yourself, Silas," I replied, my voice icy and completely devoid of any daughterly affection. "I just handed the authorities the map of your profound, ungodly greed." Silas stopped 3 feet away, his chest heaving, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked at Deshawn being shoved into the federal vehicle, and then looked back at me, his face twisting into a hideous mask of pure malicious hatred. He realized that his physical intimidation tactics would no longer work on me. I was not the terrified teenager he could banish to her room with a simple booming command. He needed a different weapon to destroy me. "You think you are the hero of this story," Silas yelled, his voice cracking with sheer hysterical desperation. "You think you are protecting your mother's precious legacy. You think you are the righteous savior coming down from New York to avenge her memory." Silas aggressively reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He marched directly over to the massive outdoor PA system Deshawn had rented for the grand opening. The federal agents were busy securing the perimeter and loading Vernon into a transport van, completely ignoring the disgraced pastor. Silas frantically jammed a thick auxiliary cable directly into his phone, jacking it straight into the main amplifier board. "Let the world hear what your mother truly thought of you before she died," Silas screamed, turning the master volume knob all the way up to the absolute maximum level. "Let everyone hear the ugly, pathetic truth about the great Chloe." A loud, sharp burst of electronic feedback pierced the air, followed by the heavy, unmistakable sound of a hospital room ventilator. The remaining crowd, the lingering reporters, and the federal agents all stopped and turned toward the massive black speakers. Then my mother's voice echoed across the wide Atlanta street. It was Beatrice. Her voice was incredibly weak, painfully raspy, and filled with profound exhaustion. It was the undeniable sound of a woman standing at the very edge of death. "I regret giving birth to Chloe." Beatrice's recorded voice gasped, echoing loudly off the surrounding brick buildings. "She is cold and she brings nothing but pain to this family. She has no heart. She abandoned us. I wish I had never seen her face." The heavy recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. The remaining crowd gasped collectively. The local news reporter clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting between me and the massive speakers. The sheer cruelty of hearing a dying mother utterly disown her own child was deeply shocking even to the hardened federal agents securing the chaotic scene. Silas stood by the amplifier, his face flushed with a sickening, victorious glee. He breathed heavily, staring at me with pure, unadulterated malice, expecting me to completely shatter. He wanted me to drop to the pavement and weep. He wanted me to break down in front of the cameras, completely destroyed by my mother's absolute rejection. Jasmine, who was still kneeling on the rough concrete, slowly lifted her head. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, ugly black streaks, but a vicious, triumphant smile slowly spread across her tear-stained face. She pushed herself up slightly, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "You hear that?" Jasmine spat, her voice dripping with sheer, venomous delight. "Even Mom hated you. She knew exactly what you were. You are nothing but a cold, bitter monster, and she died despising your very existence. You have absolutely nobody left, Chloe. You are completely alone." I stood completely still in the street. The blazing Atlanta sun beat down on my shoulders, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure freezing ice running through my veins. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not show a single fraction of an inch of emotional devastation. The psychological blow that Silas had just attempted to deliver was entirely meaningless because I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. I slowly looked down at the expensive leather briefcase resting in my left hand. I calmly popped the brass latches open, the sharp clicking sound breaking the heavy, tense silence. I reached inside the dark velvet-lined interior and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. I tapped the glass screen twice, bringing it instantly to life. I looked up, locking my gaze directly onto Silas. His triumphant smile faltered slightly as he registered my complete lack of emotional destruction. He shifted his weight nervously, his eyes darting toward the silver tablet in my steady hand. "Nice editing skills, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly measured, cutting through the humid air with surgical precision. "You always did know exactly how to twist a narrative to serve your own selfish, corrupt purposes, chopping up a private conversation, slicing out the context, and manipulating the audio to manufacture a fake emotional weapon. It is a very cheap trick. Shall we watch the unedited, notarized video? Silas let out a feral, guttural scream. The polished veneer of the holy man vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He lunged forward with both hands raised, aiming directly for the silver tablet I held. He intended to smash the device against the concrete to destroy the evidence before it could ever reach the public eye. But he never even made it past the first step. A massive federal agent, wearing a heavy tactical vest, stepped swiftly between us. The agent grabbed Silas by the lapels of his wrinkled shirt, spinning him around and slamming him forcefully against the hood of the nearest black SUV. Silas grunted in pain, his face pressing flat against the hot metal. "Stay exactly where you are," the agent commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. I did not even blink. I turned away from my struggling father and focused entirely on the massive digital promotional screen Vernon and Deshawn had erected above their stolen restaurant. They had rented a state-of-the-art outdoor display to broadcast their fake success to the entire city. It was the perfect canvas for their absolute destruction. I stepped up to the main control console, resting beside the ruined hostess stand. I plugged the auxiliary cable directly into my tablet and swiped my finger across the smooth glass. The giant bright neon logo of Beatrice's True Legacy instantly vanished from the massive screen above us. The screen went pitch black for a split second. Then my mother's face appeared towering 20 feet tall over the silenced Atlanta street. The high-definition video was crystal clear. Beatrice was lying in her sterile hospital bed, propped up by thin white pillows. Her eyes were piercing. They burned with a sharp, commanding intensity that sent a collective shiver through the massive crowd. She looked directly into the camera lens, projecting absolute authority even from her deathbed. Watching her face looming over the street, the memory of recording that video hit me with overwhelming force. It had been the absolute hardest day of my entire life. 3 years ago, I had brought Arthur Sterling and a team of senior estate lawyers directly into that cramped cardiovascular ward. The room smelled of sharp, harsh antiseptic and stale coffee. We had spent 6 grueling hours drafting the irrevocable trust and securing the intellectual property patents. But the legal maneuvering was nothing compared to the profound emotional agony of that afternoon. I sat beside her, holding her frail hand, as my mother finally verbally accepted the horrific truth about her own toxic family. She wept bitterly, acknowledging that the man she had married and the daughter she had raised alongside me were nothing but ruthless predators waiting patiently for her to die. She begged me to film her final testament to ensure no one could ever twist her words or challenge my authority after she passed. She knew exactly what Silas and Jasmine would try to do. Now her magnificent voice boomed across the wide boulevard, playing through the massive concert speakers Deshawn had paid for with stolen church money. Silas Beatrice said, her recorded voice sounding raspy but entirely unshakable. "You are a hypocrite and a thief. You hide behind your pulpit wearing expensive suits paid for by the sweat of honest working people. You preach about salvation while secretly bleeding my accounts dry. You have no faith, Silas. Your only true religion is pure, unadulterated greed. I see exactly what you are, and God sees it too." Silas squeezed his eyes shut, his cheek still pressed against the hood of the federal vehicle. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of loyal restaurant customers and church members standing in the street. "Vernon," my mother continued, her gaze shifting slightly, "you are a parasite. You could never cook. You could never lead. You have spent 20 years riding my coattails, stealing my ingredients, and claiming my hard work as your own. You are a small, weak man pretending to be a giant." Vernon sank to his knees beside the police barricade, hiding his face in his dirty hands as the federal agents stood over him. "Jasmine," my mother's voice grew heavier, laced with profound maternal sorrow. "I loved you so deeply. I tried so hard to give you everything you ever wanted. But you do not love me, Jasmine. You never loved me. You only love my credit cards, my status, and the luxury you believe you are inherently entitled to. You look at my life's work, and you only see a cash register waiting to be emptied. You are empty inside, Jasmine." Jasmine stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, The fierce, arrogant smirk she had worn just moments ago was completely gone. Her jaw trembled and she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking incredibly small under the massive shadow of our mother's image. The only person who stood by me, Beatrice declared, her voice suddenly warming with immense pride. The only person who paid my staggering medical bills, who worked brutal 80-hour weeks in New York to secretly save this business from total bankruptcy, is Chloe. She sacrificed her own happiness to protect my dream. She is the only reason Southern Elegance survived Silas's financial abuse. I kept my posture rigid, staring up at the screen as the video reached the exact moment Silas had tried to weaponize against me. "I know what my family will do when I am gone," Beatrice stated, looking directly into the camera lens again. "I know they will try to paint Chloe as the villain. I know Silas will twist my words. So let me be perfectly clear for the legal record. I regret giving birth to Chloe into this toxic family where she had to carry our burdens completely alone while you vultures picked at her bones." The missing context hit the street with the force of a physical shockwave. Silas had deliberately spliced the audio, violently cutting the sentence right before my mother explained her true meaning. She did not regret giving birth to me. She regretted forcing me to survive the intense psychological warfare of our corrupt household. She regretted that I had to endure their relentless cruelty while single-handedly saving them from total ruin. The local news reporter stared at Silas with absolute open disgust. The crowd began to murmur, pointing angry fingers at the disgraced pastor who had tried to publicly destroy his own daughter with a manipulated deathbed recording. Effective immediately, Beatrice commanded, her voice echoing with total finality. "I officially declare my youngest daughter Chloe to be my sole legal heir. She is the sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust and the sole executor of my true legacy. Silas, Jasmine, and Vernon are hereby permanently disinherited. They are entitled to absolutely nothing. I leave my life, my name, and my recipes entirely in Chloe's capable hands. May God forgive the rest of you, because I certainly will not." The video abruptly ended, the massive screen cutting back to pitch black. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. The absolute truth had finally been dragged out into the blazing Atlanta daylight, leaving no shadows for them to hide behind. Silas collapsed completely, sliding down the side of the federal SUV until he hit the hot pavement. He was utterly broken, his fabricated narrative officially dead and buried. The great tyrannical patriarch was reduced to a weeping, disgraced criminal, kneeling in the dirt. He pulled his knees to his chest, sobbing loudly as the federal agents finally hauled him up by his armpits to march him toward a waiting squad car. His financial crimes and his emotional abuse were now permanently tied together for the entire world to witness. I disconnected my tablet and calmly slid it back into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. I turned to walk away, ready to speak with the federal marshals about reclaiming my stolen intellectual property. But a frantic scrambling sound stopped me. Jasmine was crawling across the rough concrete sidewalk. She ignored her husband Deshaun screaming for his expensive lawyers. Jasmine scrambled directly toward my feet, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Her heavy theatrical makeup was completely ruined, running down her face in dark streaks. She looked up at me with wild, unhinged eyes. "Wait!" Jasmine shrieked. "Wait, Chloe! You have to listen to me. Deshaun is going to a federal prison. The church accounts are frozen. I have no money. But Mom had a $3 million life insurance policy. We are 50-50 beneficiaries. You have to give me my half, Chloe. We are blood." I stared coldly down at her. I adjusted my grip on my heavy leather briefcase. I looked at the reporters. I took a deep breath, letting the hot city air fill my lungs completely before dealing with my sister's pathetic, desperate pleas for unearned cash. The ultimate trap was finally locked firmly into place. Checkmate. Jasmine grabbed the hem of my blazer, her manicured nails dug into the tailored fabric. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, discarding the haughty millionaire persona she had worn 20 minutes prior. The heavily armed federal agents were still processing Silas and Deshaun, loading them into separate tactical vehicles. The local news cameras were capturing every second of my sister's breakdown. The bright lights reflected off her tear-stained cheeks. She knew the cameras were watching her every move. She calculated her next tactic, shifting from an aggressive tyrant to a desperate victim begging for mercy. "Chloe, please!" Jasmine wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. She pitched her voice loud enough for reporters to hear. "We are sisters! We are blood! You cannot do this! Think about our community! Think about Black family loyalty! We are supposed to protect each other, not tear each other down. You are standing there letting the feds take my husband away. You are letting them take our father. You cannot take my last lifeline too. That life insurance money is my absolute right. It is my birthright. We have to stick together." She knelt there, attempting to weaponize the concept of family she had abused for decades. She wanted the crowd to view me as a cold traitor selling out her sister. "Remember when we were little," Jasmine sobbed. "Remember playing in the backyard behind the restaurant? We used to build forts and pretend we were queens. We made promises to always have each other's backs. We swore we would never let anything come between us. I am still your big sister. You have to look into your heart and find empathy for me. You have to honor Mom's original wishes. She wanted us to share that money equally." I looked down at her tear-streaked face. Her performance was almost Oscar-worthy. The trembling lip and pleading eyes were calibrated for maximum sympathy. But looking at her, I did not see the innocent little girl. I saw a 22-year-old Jasmine sitting at our kitchen table, casually forging my signature on a federal student loan document. "Empathy?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to release my blazer. "You want to talk about sisterhood and having each other's backs? Let us talk about empathy, Jasmine. Let us talk about the moment I received an alert from a debt collection agency 2 weeks before I moved to New York. Let us talk about the paralyzing panic of discovering my big sister secretly took out a $60,000 loan in my name." Jasmine flinched violently, her eyes darting away nervously as the crowd leaned in to hear the truth. "You stole my social security number." I continued, projecting my voice clearly. "You completely destroyed my credit score right before I needed to sign a lease for my apartment. You took that money and spent every last dime on a destination wedding with Deshawn. You financed your luxury lifestyle by chaining me to a mountain of fraudulent debt. I had to work 3 separate jobs during my first year of law school just to pay off the exorbitant interest. I ate cheap ramen and slept 4 hours a night while you drank expensive champagne on vacation. You did not care about sisterhood then. You only cared about funding your fake aesthetic." Jasmine stammered, her hands shaking wildly as she looked around at the judgmental crowd. "That was a long time ago, Chloe. I was young and foolish. I made a mistake. But this is different. This is Mom's life insurance policy. It is $3 million. She split it exactly 50-50 between us. You know she did. I have the original paperwork in my safe at home. You legally owe me $1.5 million and I need it." I slowly unlatched my heavy leather briefcase again. I did not pull out the silver tablet. I reached into the side pocket and retrieved a crisp single sheet of heavy legal paper bearing the official gold watermark of the Sterling and Vance law firm. "You are absolutely correct about one thing," I said, holding the expensive paper up to the sunlight. "Mom did originally split her life insurance policy 50-50. She desperately wanted both of her daughters to be financially secure after she passed away. She wanted to be fair even after everything you had done to me." Jasmine nodded vigorously, a desperate glimmer of hope sparking in her panicked eyes. "See, I told you. You know the truth. You have to give me my half right now so I can hire a decent defense attorney for Deshawn." "But she changed her mind," I stated flatly, brutally, cutting off her premature celebration. I unfolded the thick document and handed it directly to my sister. Jasmine snatched it from my hand, her eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the page. "You were a 50% beneficiary," Jasmine, I explained, watching the remaining color completely drain from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. "Right up until last year. Right up until Mom received a very confusing certified notice from the bank regarding a missed mortgage payment on her house. a house she had completely paid off 10 years prior. Jasmine gasped loudly, the paper shaking violently in her trembling grip. She looked like she was going to be physically ill right there on the sidewalk. Mom hired a forensic accountant. I continued, making sure the entire street heard the undeniable truth of her betrayal. She discovered that you had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on her home. You ruthlessly forged her signature on the deed transfer documents. You leveraged the house she worked her entire life to pay for, just so you could funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into Deshawn's fraudulent offshore crypto scam. You recklessly gambled with your dying mother's only secure asset. No, Jasmine whimpered, shaking her head in pure absolute denial. No, the crypto was supposed to hit big. Deshawn promised me it would triple in value within 6 months. We were going to pay her back before she even noticed the money was missing. We were going to buy her a much better house in a richer neighborhood. You stole her security? I stated, my tone absolutely merciless. When Mom found out the absolute depth of your betrayal, she did not just cry. She took immediate legal action to protect what little she had left. She completely removed you from the policy entirely. I pointed a manicured finger at the bottom paragraph of the document she was holding. Read the final amendment, Jasmine. Read it aloud if you want. I am the 100% sole beneficiary of that $3 million policy. You are entitled to absolutely nothing, not a single solitary dime. Jasmine dropped the paper as if it had suddenly caught fire, burning her fingers. She stared at me, her mind frantically trying to process the absolute totality of her financial ruin. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down upon her head. You have no money, I said, listing her grim reality with brutal efficiency. Your husband is currently sitting in a federal transport vehicle facing 20 years for money laundering and wire fraud. Your church accounts have been permanently seized by the IRS. You have no husband, Jasmine. You have no stolen restaurant. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers so she could see the absolute lack of pity in my eyes. And you have no house. Jasmine's breath hitched sharply. What are you talking about? The massive mansion you currently live in. I clarified, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The one you bought using the stolen church funds. The federal government seized it this morning. And since MTech Holdings, my private investment firm, quietly bought up the outstanding debt from your fraudulent second mortgage, I officially own the deed to your property. I stood back up, smoothing out my gray blazer. Consider this your official 24-hour eviction notice. You have until tomorrow morning to pack whatever cheap clothes the feds allow you to keep and get off my property before I have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing. Jasmine let out a raw, guttural scream of primal despair. She slammed her fists against the hot pavement, completely shattered, mourning the violent death of her stolen wealth. As her screams filled the air, a loud banging drew my attention toward the police barricade. Uncle Vernon was sitting in the back of a police cruiser. He slammed his cuffed hands against the glass, his face purple with fury. You think the community will actually eat at your place? He yelled, his eyes burning with vengeance. You are a traitor, Chloe. We will boycott you. You will never sell a single plate of food in the city. Vernon twisted violently in the back seat of the police cruiser, his sweaty face pressed against the reinforced glass. He continued screaming, trying to incite a riot. He pointed his cuffed hands toward me, thrashing against the restraint of the officers. Listen to me, Atlanta! He bellowed, his voice carrying through the cracked window of the squad car. She is an elite snob coming down from New York to destroy a successful black business. She is throwing her own family in a federal prison just to line her corporate pockets. She does not care about this community. She does not care about our culture or our heritage. Do not let her do this to us. Vernon shouted, his voice vibrating with manufactured outrage. She is a corporate sellout. If you eat at her restaurant, you are supporting a traitor. We need to boycott her. We need to run her out of the city. She thinks her fancy law degree makes her better than us. She is trying to tear down everything we built together. The words hung heavily in the humid morning air. The crowd of eager customers who had come for a grand opening celebration now stood in stunned silence, shifting uneasily on their feet. Vernon was playing a very old, very effective card. He was weaponizing class solidarity and racial loyalty to shield himself from his own criminal actions. I watched the murmurs ripple through the crowd. Some of the onlookers crossed their arms, casting suspicious glances my way. The narrative of a ruthless northern lawyer destroying a beloved local establishment was easy to digest. Even the restaurant staff, standing together in their matching white aprons, looked deeply conflicted. They had just watched their bosses get hauled away in handcuffs. They were terrified about their livelihoods, their paychecks, and their futures. I turned my attention away from the screeching man in the police cruiser and focused entirely on the group of employees huddled near the shattered velvet ropes. I walked directly toward the old head chef. It was the exact same man who had spat at my feet just an hour earlier, fiercely defending Vernon's stolen empire. The chef stiffened as I approached, his calloused hands wiping nervously against his stained apron. He was a veteran of the Atlanta culinary scene, a man who had worked the line for 40 years. He looked at me with a mixture of deep suspicion and profound exhaustion. He expected me to fire him on the spot. He expected me to act exactly like the elite snob Vernon was currently describing, but looking into his weary eyes, I remembered exactly how Vernon had treated the people who actually kept the kitchen running. During my forensic audit of the restaurant accounts, I had uncovered the brutal reality of Vernon's management style. While he paraded around the dining room, shaking hands and acting like a benevolent patriarch, he was ruthlessly exploiting the very community he claimed to champion. I remembered reading the payroll ledgers, realizing that Vernon routinely shortchanged the kitchen staff. He skimmed heavily from the waitstaff tip pool, citing incredibly tight profit margins to justify the missing cash. He claimed the restaurant was struggling to keep the lights on while he secretly siphoned their hard-earned money. The sheer hypocrisy was staggering. Vernon had stolen thousands of dollars directly from the pockets of dishwashers, line cooks, and servers. He stole from single mothers and struggling college students working double shifts. And while he fed them lies about tight margins and financial struggles, he used their stolen tips to make the lease payments on his brand new customized Cadillac Escalade. He parked that massive glittering testament to his greed right by the kitchen door, forcing his underpaid staff to walk past it every single day after their grueling shifts. I stopped directly in front of the head chef. I did not raise my voice to yell back at Vernon. I did not engage in a screaming match with a man sitting in the back of a police car. That was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to drag me down into the mud and create a public spectacle. Instead, I calmly raised my silver tablet. I pressed the screen mirroring function, instantly reconnecting my device to the massive outdoor promotional display hanging above the main entrance of the restaurant. The screen flared to life, replacing the dark void with a crisp, brightly lit legal document. It was blown up to massive proportions, displaying clear, undeniable numbers and bold black text for the entire street to see. "Look up at the screen," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly, addressing the entire staff. The head chef frowned slowly, lifting his gaze to the massive display. The murmuring crowd fell silent again, straining their necks to read the glowing document. It was a completely new, comprehensive employment contract for Beatrice's Southern Elegance. "For the past 5 years, Uncle Vernon has paid you the absolute lowest legal minimum wage allowed by the state," I announced, my voice echoing off the brick buildings. I pointed up at the screen. "He routinely skimmed 20% of your tips to fund his personal vehicle leases and his luxury vacations. He told you the business was barely surviving while he was stealing your money. He claimed to care about this community while he actively starved the people who actually did the heavy lifting. That era of exploitation ends today." I tapped the tablet, highlighting the specific compensation clauses in bright yellow. "Under my ownership, Beatrice's Southern Elegance is immediately shifting to an employee profit-sharing model," I declared. The head chef's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as he read the giant numbers glowing on the screen above him. "Effective tomorrow, every single employee returning to work will receive a 20% increase in their base wages." You will also receive full comprehensive healthcare coverage entirely paid for by the business. You will no longer have to choose between paying rent and buying medicine. I swiped the screen again, revealing the final section of the revolutionary contract. But most importantly, I continued looking directly into the old chef's eyes. Anyone who has worked in this kitchen or served in this dining room for over 5 years is receiving a direct equity stake in the company. You helped build my mother's legacy. You kept her recipes alive while Vernon took all the credit. You are not just employees anymore. You are official stakeholders in Beatrice's Southern elegance. Your success is now permanently tied to the restaurant's success. The old head chef stared at the screen, his chest heaving as the reality of my words finally registered. He had worked his entire life in hot, demanding kitchens, constantly disrespected and perpetually underpaid. He had defended Vernon because Vernon was the devil he knew. But looking at the binding legal contracts promising him actual ownership and unprecedented financial security, the tough exterior he had maintained for decades instantly shattered. His knees buckled slightly, and he let out a loud, choked sob right there on the busy Atlanta sidewalk. The chef lunged forward completely, abandoning his tough demeanor, and wrapped his strong arms around my shoulders in a fierce, crushing embrace. He wept openly, his tears soaking into the fabric of my gray blazer. "Thank you," he choked out, his voice raw with pure emotion. "God bless you, Chloe." The rest of the staff erupted into deafening cheers. Waitstaff and line cooks began hugging each other, jumping up and down in pure, unadulterated joy. The onlookers, who had been murmuring suspiciously just moments ago, immediately joined in, clapping loudly and shouting their overwhelming support. The entire community completely turned their backs on the police cruiser. Vernon's desperate attempts to weaponize racial loyalty and class division had utterly failed. He watched through the reinforced glass, his face pale and slack, as the very people he had tried to manipulate openly celebrated his absolute downfall. The federal agents finally slammed their doors shut, putting an end to his pathetic performance. The sirens wailed again as the heavily armored tactical vehicles pulled away from the curb, taking Deshawn and Vernon away to face decades in a federal penitentiary. I gently patted the chef's back, giving him a moment to collect himself before stepping away. The crowd was still cheering loudly, celebrating the rebirth of a true community staple. I turned back toward the chaotic scene, surveying the damage and the remaining law enforcement personnel. That was when I saw my father. Silas was still sitting heavily on the concrete curb, his hands securely cuffed behind his back. Two federal agents stood directly behind him, waiting for the final transport van to arrive. The purple silk shirt he wore was stained with sweat. He looked up at me as I approached, his shadow casting a dark stain across the pavement. He looked absolutely wretched. The powerful, booming megachurch pastor was entirely gone. He was nothing but a broken old man facing the terrifying reality of spending the rest of his natural life behind cold steel bars. He stared at me, his bloodshot eyes filled with a sickening mixture of pure hatred and desperate pleading panic. He knew his kingdom had fallen, but his narcissistic mind simply refused to accept the finality of his earthly judgment. "The Bible says to forgive 70 times 7. Silas rasped, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze. He strained his neck, trying to look me in the eye. He was still trying to use scripture to manipulate me, still trying to wield the word of God as a shield for his crimes. "You owe me that much right now. You cannot just leave me to the absolute mercy of these ruthless federal prosecutors. They will completely destroy me. They will lock me away in a dark cell for the rest of my natural life. You have the money now. You have the power. You must save me. If you walk away from your own flesh and blood today, then God will certainly judge you for your profound wickedness. God will strike you down for completely turning your back on your own father who truly loved you." I stared down at the pathetic figure crumpled on the dirty concrete. Silas was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the sweat-stained silk of his expensive designer shirt. The blazing Atlanta sun beat down upon his bowed head, highlighting the thinning gray hair he usually kept so carefully styled for his massive television audience. He was trembling violently. The heavy metal handcuffs bit deeply into his wrists, restraining the hands that had once slammed pulpits and pointed accusatory fingers at thousands of terrified congregants. Now those hands were entirely useless. He was entirely useless. He looked up at me again, his eyes wide with a feral, desperate panic. He genuinely expected his guilt trip to work. He genuinely believed that throwing the name of God in my face would force me to open my checkbook and hire the most expensive white-collar defense firm in the country to save his miserable skin. He thought the old conditioning would automatically kick in, forcing me to submit to his patriarchal authority just as I always had when I was a frightened child. His weaponization of faith was nothing new. As I looked into his terrified, bloodshot eyes, the bustling sounds of the street around me began to fade. The noise of the federal agents securing the perimeter and the low murmurs of the stunned restaurant staff dissolved into a muted hum. I was suddenly transported back to the suffocatingly dark mahogany-paneled office of his megachurch. I was 16 years old, sitting rigidly in a stiff leather chair, while Silas paced back and forth behind his massive desk. I had just proudly shown him my early college acceptance letters and my ambitious plans to study business and corporate law in New York. I had expected a fatherly smile or a word of encouragement. Instead, he had snatched the papers from my hand and slammed his massive leather-bound Bible down onto the polished wood with a deafening crack that made me physically jump in my seat. I remember the exact cruel pitch of his voice as he towered over my trembling teenage frame. He told me that my ambitions were inherently sinful. He twisted sacred scripture into a jagged weapon designed specifically to cut down my self-esteem. He preached that a woman seeking worldly education and financial independence was arrogant, rebellious, and actively defying the natural divine order of the household. He told me that my only righteous path was to remain quietly in the kitchen, serving the family, and eventually serving a husband of his absolute choosing. He used the concept of divine judgment as a psychological cage, deliberately trying to terrorize me into abandoning my dreams so I would remain a compliant, useful servant in his fraudulent empire. He made me believe that God himself hated my ambition. For years, that heavy spiritual manipulation had chained me down, filling my heart with a profound, unearned guilt. But standing here now, bathing in the warm afternoon light, I realized that his psychological cage was completely destroyed. His twisted theology held absolutely zero power over me anymore. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel any lingering filial duty. I did not even feel the hot burning rage that had fueled my initial return to Atlanta. Looking down at the disgraced patriarch of the Wilson family, I felt nothing but pure, absolute indifference. It was a cold, quiet emptiness that signaled the total death of his influence over my soul. He was just a man. He was just a sad, greedy little man who had finally been caught stealing from his own community to fund his lavish lifestyle. I slowly crouched down, bringing myself perfectly level with his frantic, sweating face. I rested my forearms on my knees, keeping my posture completely relaxed and unbothered. The two massive federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests standing directly behind him tensed slightly, watching my movements closely, but they allowed me this final moment of confrontation. Silas leaned in slightly, his eyes darting frantically across my face, searching for any microscopic sign of mercy, any tiny sliver of the obedient daughter he had tried to violently mold. He found absolutely nothing. My expression remained entirely blank, a smooth mask of calm detachment. "You want to quote scripture to me now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying a sharp, lethal clarity that cut through the humid air. "You want to use the Bible as a shield to protect you from the federal consequences of your own massive financial crimes. You think tossing out a verse about forgiveness will magically erase the millions of dollars you systematically stole from your vulnerable congregation. You think it will erase the intense psychological warfare you waged against your own wife as she lay dying in a sterile hospital bed, begging for peace." Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, Chloe, please. He whimpered, his bravado entirely gone. You have the trust fund. You have Beatrice's money. You can afford the best lawyers in the state. You can get these charges reduced. I am your father. You cannot do this. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, ensuring he heard every single syllable of my final verdict. Galatians chapter 6 verse 7. Dad. I stated, my tone incredibly even and perfectly controlled. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Silas flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the jaw. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the reality of my words. You sowed absolute, unadulterated greed. I continued, my voice remaining completely steady. You sowed theft, manipulation, and profound emotional betrayal. You planted seeds of cruelty in everyone who ever trusted you. You robbed the working-class families who faithfully attended your Sunday services, believing your lies. You stole from the very community you swore to spiritually protect. You bled my mother dry, and then you gleefully prepared to dance on her grave. You sowed nothing but destruction, Silas, and now the harvest is finally here. Enjoy your harvest. I stood up slowly, towering over him once again. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored gray blazer and looked down at him with supreme finality. I am not paying a single cent for your legal defense. I am not spending one dime of my mother's hard-earned money to bail out the predator who terrorized her. You are entirely on your own. You can request a public defender when you face the federal judge on Monday morning. No! Silas screamed, a raw, terrifying sound of complete structural collapse. No, you cannot do this to me. I am the head of this family. I am the patriarch. You owe me your obedience. You owe me everything. His screams meant absolutely nothing. His patriarchal dominance was completely and permanently shattered. He was no longer a feared authority figure dictating the lives of the women around him. He was just a broke, disgraced criminal, throwing a pathetic temper tantrum on a public sidewalk. I gave a brief nod to the two towering federal agents standing behind him. They immediately stepped forward, grabbing Silas roughly by his armpits and hauling him forcefully to his feet. His knees buckled, but they dragged him effortlessly toward the reinforced back doors of the waiting armored transport van. He kicked and thrashed, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the hot asphalt, but his physical resistance was entirely futile against the trained officers. The agents shoved him into the dark interior of the federal vehicle. He twisted his neck, trying to look back at me one last time, his face a mask of absolute terror and helpless rage. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive booming thud, cutting off his frantic screams instantly. The thick tinted windows hid him from the world, sealing his fate completely. He was gone. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my leather briefcase held securely in my right hand. The commanding officer of the federal raid gave me a brief, respectful nod before climbing into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. The engines roared to life, a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. One by one, the convoy of black tactical SUVs and local police cruisers pulled away from the curb. The flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding brick buildings in rhythmic pulses of color as the vehicles accelerated down the wide boulevard. The wailing sirens grew fainter and fainter, slowly dissolving into the ambient noise of the bustling southern city, until they completely faded away into the distance. The heavy, oppressive silence that followed was incredibly profound. It was the sound of a massive toxic burden finally being lifted from the atmosphere. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the warm afternoon air fill my lungs entirely. The tightness that had lived in my chest for the past 5 years, the constant suffocating anxiety of waiting for my family's next betrayal was completely gone. I was finally truly free. I stood completely alone in the street. The chaotic crowd of reporters, curious onlookers, and loyal restaurant patrons had slowly dispersed, retreating back to their daily lives now that the dramatic spectacle was officially over. The newly empowered kitchen staff had already rushed back inside the building, eager to begin cleaning and preparing for a new era of honest work under a fair, equitable contract. The sidewalk was empty, save for a few discarded grand opening flyers fluttering gently in the summer breeze. I slowly turned around, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. I faced the large brick building that housed my mother's culinary dream. I looked up at the massive digital screen still displaying the profit-sharing employment contracts. Below the screen, the original hand-painted wooden sign hung proudly above the heavy oak double doors. It read Beatrice's Southern Elegance in elegant swirling gold letters. The deceptive neon signs Vernon had erected were currently sitting unplugged in a dumpster out back. The stolen empire had been completely dismantled, piece by piece, document by document. The toxic weeds that had choked this business and this family had been ruthlessly, violently pulled out by their roots and discarded. The air felt remarkably clean. The future felt incredibly bright. I smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The rich, savory scent of simmering collard greens and fried chicken wafted through the air, welcoming me home. I gripped the brass handle of the heavy oak door, pushing it open to reveal the bustling activity of my newly acquired kitchen. The storm is over. It is time to rebuild. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of Beatrice's Southern Elegance swung wide open to welcome a massive line of eager customers that stretched entirely around the busy city block. The grand reopening was an absolute, undeniable triumph. The newly renovated dining room buzzed with vibrant electric energy. Rich, warm sunlight spilled through the tall, pristine glass windows, illuminating the polished hardwood floors and the elegant floral centerpieces gracing every single table. The air was thick with the intoxicating, mouth-watering aroma of authentic Southern soul food. The savory scent of slow braised collard greens, sharp buttermilk biscuits, and perfectly seasoned fried chicken completely erased the stale, sterile atmosphere Vernon had tried to force upon the sacred space. A lively jazz quartet played in the corner, their upbeat melodies mingling seamlessly with the loud, joyful chatter of the packed house. The local community had not just returned, they had rallied around the historic restaurant with an unprecedented level of fierce, loyal support. I walked gracefully through the swinging metal doors into the bustling hot kitchen. The internal transformation was absolutely breathtaking. Gone was the oppressive, toxic atmosphere of fear and resentment that had poisoned this workspace for so many long years. Under the new employee profit-sharing model, the dedicated staff moved with deliberate purpose, immense pride, and genuine enthusiasm. The old head chef stood firmly at the helm of the busy line, calling out fresh orders with a booming, cheerful voice. He caught my eye as I walked past, wiping his brow with a clean white towel. He gave me a massive, grinning thumbs up. The talented line cooks and waitstaff hummed with synchronized, beautiful efficiency. There was no more brutal screaming over tight margins. There was no more cruel theft. The crippling anxiety of the past was completely eradicated, replaced by the empowering reality of true shared ownership. Pausing near the gleaming stainless steel prep stations, I took a deep, stabilizing breath. I allowed myself a rare, quiet moment to reflect on the grueling, brutal journey that had brought me to this exact victorious spot. I thought about the frightened, exhausted young girl who had been violently pushed aside at her own mother's somber funeral. I remembered standing alone in the freezing rain, listening to Silas and Jasmine gleefully divide an empire they had done absolutely nothing to build. I remembered the suffocating heavy weight of being the designated family scapegoat, the convenient punching bag they eagerly used to absorb their own massive personal inadequacies. But I had stubbornly refused to break. I had taken their relentless, unyielding cruelty and expertly forged it into an unbreakable steel armor. Now I stood here proudly as the undisputed successful leader of my family's true authentic legacy. The greedy predators who had tried to devour my mother's beautiful dream had been entirely thoroughly neutralized. The strict justice they faced was incredibly swift, absolute, and completely unyielding. Silas was officially serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and heavy tax evasion. The stern judge had shown absolutely zero mercy for a corrupt man who selfishly stole from his own faithful congregation. Deshaun was currently sitting in the exact same dreary facility, occupying the cold cell block directly next to his disgraced, miserable father-in-law. They had plenty of isolated time to discuss their failed criminal conspiracies behind thick, unforgiving steel bars. Jasmine had lost absolutely every single thing. The relentless federal government had officially seized her fraudulent, sprawling mansion, her expensive designer wardrobe, and her shiny luxury vehicles. The arrogant, pampered former princess who had constantly mocked my brutal work ethic was now renting a cramped, dingy little one-bedroom apartment on the lonely outskirts of the sprawling city. She worked a grueling, demanding minimum-wage retail job, tirelessly folding cheap, scratchy sweaters under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, just to barely survive. Vernon had sadly filed for total, complete bankruptcy. The tight community he had desperately tried to falsely weaponize against me had entirely furiously shunned him. He was a universally recognized pathetic pariah, completely unable to show his face in any respectable local establishment in Atlanta without instantly drawing deeply disgusted stares and quietly angry muttered insults. They were all completely, thoroughly destroyed by the very toxic greed they had foolishly worshipped. I confidently pushed through the heavy kitchen doors, smoothly returning to the incredibly lively dining room. I quietly made my way to a small, specially reserved table, tucked neatly into the far back corner of the warm restaurant. It was the exact precise spot where Beatrice always used to sit and diligently balance the thick ledgers after a late closing. The thick red velvet cushion felt deeply familiar and immensely comforting. The talented head chef emerged quickly from the kitchen, carefully carrying a pristine white porcelain plate. He walked directly to my small table and set it very gently in front of me. It was a massive, perfectly steaming hot slice of Beatrice's incredibly famous signature peach cobbler. The golden, beautifully flaky crust bubbled wonderfully with rich, dark cinnamon and sweet caramelized brown sugar. A perfectly round, generous scoop of rich vanilla bean ice cream slowly melted beautifully across the hot, spiced fruit. I picked up my polished silver fork and took a slow, incredibly deliberate bite. The sweet, deeply warm flavor exploded across my eager palate, tasting exactly like my early childhood, exactly like a true home. It was the pure, totally unadulterated, delicious taste of absolute, undeniable victory. I slowly looked up from my warm plate. Hanging prominently on the exposed red brick wall directly across from my quiet table was a beautifully framed, stunning oil portrait. It was a vibrant, incredibly lifelike painting of my amazing mother. Beatrice looked down at the packed, wildly thriving restaurant with a warm, intensely knowing smile. Her piercing dark eyes seemed to shine beautifully with profound, endless pride and love. Mother and daughter finally at peace, their legacy secure absolute victory.